Yes, Nicola.
Okay, so today I'm hopefully going to demonstrate how we can start to plan for progression and coherence within the curriculum. It's really great to hear them from Tracy and Kerry to see actually what it does look like in the classroom. Some of the slides you'll see today are reminders of our last session. I just want to try and take us forward from where we were last time. Okay, so before we dive into looking at science and technology, I want to just focus on some of the important design elements that we need to take on board when we move into this planning phase. As it says on the slide here, there isn't a blueprint. We don't have that Blue Peter model that's already been produced that we're going to bring out at the end. But what there are some wrong ways of doing it. So those 4 blocks on there, which are taken from some of the work by Lucy Crean, a curriculum that's too full. We need to have, as the ladies mentioned before, we need to have the appropriate amount of breadth and depth. We need to make sure we've got enough time to do less things well. We don't want a curriculum that focuses entirely on the acquisition of knowledge, but we've got to have knowledge. We don't want a curriculum that focuses entirely on skill development or a curriculum that's lots of unrelated information. We want that connection. Here are some quotes from one of my favourite Marys, Mary Myatt. She talks an awful lot of sense when it comes to curriculum design and planning. So these are just taken from those books that you can see at the top there. But that one at the top, when a curriculum lacks coherence, it's harder to teach and harder for children to learn. It's got to be underpinned by a clear rationale and conceptual rigour. So we're going to explore some of those elements today. Here we were last time. So last time we started by looking at the analogy of the half-built building, so the shard building here. So if we continue that theme, we've got our architect's drawing, we've got the framework, we're in pursuit of those 4 purposes. So if we think about that observatory, which you can't see on that picture, at the top of the shard, what's going to be underneath holding it up? So if we just have a look at this one here, we've got those key elements of the framework. What's really important is we don't see these different pillars as bolt-ons, but as part of that coherent curriculum, which need to be considered within the design and planning process. The skills can't and won't develop in isolation, and the statements of what matters, as we've already discovered, are so much more than a home for the I can statements. So we've got to have a look at progression across all elements. We've also got to take on board different aspects of the curriculum framework. So here we've got the pedagogical principles. We need to start making the connections between the pedagogy and the curriculum design process. So if we look at that very first statement, curriculum design for all learners is underpinned by the 12 pedagogical principles. If you just have a look at the bits that I've highlighted in yellow, they're the ones that I'm going to hopefully try and focus on today. So the first one, talking about the overall purposes of the curriculum. Number 4, they're problem solving, creative and critical thinking, so leading into those integral skills, building on prior knowledge and experiences, authentic context, ranges within and across the areas, reinforcing those cross-curricular skills regularly. So we've got to make sure that we're building on and using what we know about the pedagogical principles to build our curriculum. This image is taken from Successful Futures. I love the way it shows that learners have got that same destination that we've talked about before. So we've got our statements of what matter as the destination for the learners. But as you can see here, the learners are going to take different routes. For me, it represents both the support that learners will receive and will need to get there, but also how different schools will plan their curricula to take learners to the same place, but on different routes. It was really good to hear Tracy talking about how we learn and the teaching strategies that can be used. This next element, I really want to highlight how we can use what cognitive science tells us about how we learn when planning our curriculum. So there's lots of things that we already know that have come out of cognitive science about how we can convert knowledge and skills into our long-term memory so that we're fluent and that we can use it. I just want to highlight some of these. So the fact that knowledge builds on knowledge, we've got to really sequence that curriculum to make sure that it builds on prior learning. Linking, the more we can make connections, the easier it is for those schemas schemas to transfer that information, that we can get it into the long-term memory, and the big picture thinking, allowing us to convert that learning into that long-term memory. And as it says in the green box there, if we don't use it, we'll lose it. So we've got to learn from how children learn to support the curriculum design process. So sequencing the curriculum, here I've taken some information from the Symbiosis book there by Kat Howard and Claire Hill, really good book that considers and really looks at curriculum coherence. So essentially it means that the order at which you choose to teach your curriculum and why you teach what you do when you teach it, but it's more than just identifying the order in which we teach things, it's about the relationships and the connections between the different aspects. We've also got to consider the principles of progression. So these 5 principles, the first one there shown in purple is centered around the individual and how they progress as a learner. But the other 4 principles need to underpin progression and need to be considered throughout the planning process. The next few slides are hopefully going to show how these principles can be embedded within the process of design and how we can use them to drive progression. Within the example, I'm going to focus back on science and technology. It's the one that I know, it's the one that I'm most familiar with. And also it really does connect with all other areas, because as soon as we start talking about the world around us, the people within it and the relationships that they have, we're talking about science. So it's also where the skills and knowledge collide, where numeracy and literacy collide. So it's a good one to exemplify some of these aspects. So if you remember back to the last session, here's that planning template that I shared and went about showing you how we could unpack the statements of what matters. And I know quite a few of you have moved on to using this. So I'm going to stick with this what matters statement. The world around us is full of living things which depend on each other for survival. I'm hopefully going to show you how we can move that forward. So here's the destination, here's the what matters statement and the rationale. But from speaking to many of you since my last session, who had a go at highlighting those key aspects, it was really hard. It's, you know, in science and technology, because we're quite a content heavy area, it's probably easier to see what those key aspects are, but within others, and some of them within science and technology, there's lots of information that you've also got to consider. You've got to digest that designing your curriculum section and to see the area of learning and experience as a whole. So we need to be able to use that narrative and what we've learned from the designing your curriculum to identify those key concepts for learning. So here they were that we identified last time. But now we're at this stage. We've got the destination. We know what matters most, but how do we get there? So we've got that destination. To quote Mary Myatt and another favourite of mine, Mark Burns, what does beautiful look like when you reach the destination? What will learners know, be able to do and have experienced? What does that journey look like? So how do we go from that what matters statement to really thinking about what the learning looks like and how learners will progress? So here's the Pisley or the growler. I think it's a Pisley. It looks like the father was it's probably a growler. It looks like the father was a grizzly with the colouring. So I introduced you last time. He represents that deep learning that will have taken place. And so what would beautiful look like when they get to the end of the curriculum? So when they get to age 16 and they've realised that destination. And David mentioned this before when he talked about assessment. How successful is the curriculum and teaching and learning? For me, when learners at 16 or those that have reached that stage look at this image, they'd be able to describe the adaptations, the reproduction and competition between the grizzlies and the polar bears, the changing habitats and the impact of humanity, the role of natural selection and how this has led to evolution of a species of bear, potentially. And if we showed this to a pupil age 5, what would the image look like? What would beautiful look like to them? Well, hopefully they'd be able to recognise that it's a living thing and they'd be able to describe the bear and identify some of the features. They'd be able to make some observations about the environment at which it lives at. So both of them are on a different step of that journey, but moving towards that deeper understanding. So I showed you this last time. So what is progression and what it isn't? So it's that moving towards expert understanding. So the descriptions of learning. So how can we use the descriptions of learning to help us understand progression? How can we use them in conjunction with the principles of progression to understand what it means for learners to progress? So that's what we're going to focus on now. So these progression steps are those check-in points, remember. So we need to consider them for each what matters statement. They're not in themselves intended for as a basis of assessment. There shouldn't be a tick list. There shouldn't be one task that assesses whether they've met that point, but they should support practitioners to provide them information on what learning looks like when they reach that stage. So we're going to start by focusing on progression step 3 here. So I've just highlighted that. So as we move forward, and I did briefly show you this last time, so how can we unpack that progression step and make sense of it? So we need to consider what learning experience, context for learning could be planned. As you see, it doesn't mention the Pizzly bear here. It doesn't mention bears at all. So this is where we've got our autonomy to make decisions about curriculum content. We need to ensure that the progression leads to learning and the context. It's important to look backwards and to look forwards and to consider the skills and knowledge that the learners will already have at this point to move them forward. So here's progression step 2. So that's where they've come from. The blue box there is where they've come from. It says I can recognize that what I do and the things I use can have an impact on the environment and on living things. I can explore relationships between living things, their habitats and their lifestyle. So in 3 years, how do we move from that concrete understanding that they've got at progression step 2 to increased understanding? And as we look at those descriptions, they're describing how they compete, describing the features, explaining the roles of the different organs. So this is what they've got. This is where they're coming from at progression steps 1 and 2. Notice we don't have any detail about the context. We don't have the living things that they should learn about. We don't have the resources identified that they should learn about. It's up to the teachers to use their expertise to identify what's needed here. So in this example, I'm moving from food as something that I use to really understanding how living things compete for specific resources. So if we just look at what that might look like. So they'd look at food production. They'd then introduce the words producers and consumers and be thinking about what they mean and developing their understanding. As we move forward, we might enter the terminology of carnivores, herbivores and omnivores and the different feeding relationships. So looking at diets, use of food in the body for growth and energy. We'd then look at food chains and how we move energy through the food chains. We'd look at competition between species, and then we'd look at predator-prey relationships and how this impacts on the population size. We look at this second strand here where we're looking at features of living things. How does that then come together and build towards those progression steps at 3? So nutrition as a characteristic of life, plant leaves, roots, so the organs of the plant and their involvement in nutrition. So organs, what are they? If we were looking at mammals here, we might be looking at the mouth, the stomach and the intestines, the digestive system. We then move on to looking at digestion. What is it? What's it used for? We might look at malnutrition as what happens when things might go wrong. And then we can link between those different stages. So you can see that we're building that knowledge and understanding as we move from progression step 2 to progression step 3 during that 3-year year of learning. Okay, we can see some more examples there. So as we move on, so this is where we looked at what it might look like at the end. So I'm going to move past the Pizzly bear there. So how does the learning enable the achievement of the 4 purposes? So we've got to always go back to those 4 purposes. And if you just look at some of these things that I've highlighted in yellow and the addition that I've added to these statements. So making informed decisions, thinking about conservation, the impact of themselves and humanity on the environment, creating ideas, problem solving, connecting and applying that knowledge to different concepts, explaining the ideas and concepts, and then ethical informed citizens looking at sustainability of the planet and protecting biodiversity. So hopefully you can see how that learning links back. We look at the principle of progression here, deepening understanding of the ideas and disciplines within this area. We can see here that this learning here is primarily from biology. So we look at what I've highlighted there in yellow. As they progress, they need to experience and understand disciplinary learning. This is what we've got here. In each of the areas of learning, to see the context of the four purposes and the statements of what matters. So we're going to move on to look at another example here, which is an example taken from the chemistry, what would traditionally be in chemistry. I've highlighted the key concepts again. So here they are. All living things are made of matter, properties of materials. Again, going back, so we've got that destination, we've identified our key concepts, we know what matters most, but how do we turn that? How does that realize itself? What does learning look like? What does beautiful look like when we reach that destination? So I've got another example here. So if we just look at a big picture, in this example, it's just some plastic packaging. So what would beautiful look like? Well, at 16, you'd want them to be able to explain how the plastic, this example, is made, how it comes from crude oil, the many different processes and chemical reactions that occur in order to create the material, the bonding within the plastic, and how this gives rise to the properties which make it useful. They'd be able to investigate the properties and compare and contrast alternative materials. They'd also be able to discuss the different methods of disposal, evaluating their impact on the environment. At 5, beautiful would still lead towards that destination, describing the materials, exploring and communicating their own ideas about them. So if we look at progression step 5 and see how we can draw out that learning and identify a context to support progression in this area, we can see it says, I can use my knowledge of the atomic nature of matter to explain the structure and properties of materials and apply this to their uses. Now, I don't want to frighten anybody. This traditionally would be GCSE chemistry. You don't need to understand chemistry to understand what I'm trying to show you here, but I think it demonstrates nicely how we can move right the way up that continuum. Okay, so how do I know what to teach and how to teach it? So this statement doesn't identify the types of materials. It doesn't tell us what the properties are or where we've got to use our expertise and our autonomy to make those curriculum choices. So we can see there in blue, that's the learning that they'd have at progression step 4, taking us to that smaller, as we go up the continuum, we tend to get less statements that are broader and hold more information when you break them down. So again, 3 years worth of learning, developing skills and gaining experience during that time. So these were the key concepts that they'll have got at steps 1 to 4. I'm just going to highlight those ones in bold. So they'd know about solids, liquids and gases. They'd know some of the properties of materials, and they'd have explored some chemical reactions. So we have a look at how this builds the learning forwards from progression step 4 and develops their understanding. Okay, so we've got those 3 aspects that they'd have learnt about. There's going to be some big words on here that some of you may have encountered when you're at school. It doesn't matter if we don't understand what they are. I just want to show you how that learning would build, how the sequence is important and really crucial here. Because if you miss out one aspect, the rest of it just won't make sense and the learners will struggle to understand. So once we've got a good understanding of the states of matter, we can then start introducing elements and then understanding of the periodic table. And once we've got there, we can then start looking at the atomic structure, what's inside atoms, the electronic structure, and how they form ions. We can then look at the properties of materials. So going from what those properties are to looking at the types of bonding and how that explains what those properties are and how they behave. To understand the types of bonding, we've got to understand and connect to electronic structure and ion formation. When we look at chemical reactions, we've got to be able to explain them. We've got to be able to understand the collision theory, which connects us to solids, liquids and gases. It's the way those atoms move. Once we've got an understanding of the collision theory, we can then look at the role of electrons in chemical reactions. And then we can understand the stability of material. So those three strands come together to give us that deeper understanding. If we look at how we can bring this all together in a scientific concept, so here's an article that I found in a newspaper a couple of years ago. I don't know if you remember the Samsung phones when they were going on fire, when the batteries were causing the fires to their phones to explode, as it says here. So how can we bring the scientific knowledge together to allow students to understand what that article is telling us. So we build that knowledge so they understand the periodic table. From there, we can understand how we get metals from the ground, how we extract them, and the chemical reactions such as electrolysis that we need to get hold of the metals as elements. We then look at group 1 metals because in this example we're looking at lithium batteries. We then have got to understand atomic structure and electronic structure and ion formation, which leads us to understanding what metallic bonding is and what ionic bonding is, and how electrolysis can then be used to extract and allow us to use those elements within the batteries, and the electrochemistry behind all that. So there's an awful lot of deep learning that has to happen to get to a point where we can understand and explain why and how some batteries explode. So going back to our principles of progression, increasing that depth and breadth. So we want both breadth and depth, so increasing sophistication and understanding of those concepts that underpin the different statements. We've got to be able to apply the knowledge. So there we've got an example of how we applied it to the battery to consolidate their understanding. And just one last bit is where we link with the other statements of what matters. So we've got to build those connections to enable them to learn and understand and to get those to get the knowledge into that long-term memory so they become fluent and can build on it. We've got to make those connections. So here I'm linking to what matters 1 within science and technology, which is all about being curious and searching for answers. If we look at the progression step 5, it says I can evaluate the effectiveness and impact of science and technology solutions on personal, social and environmental level. So we just have a look at that really quickly. So effectiveness and impact of lithium batteries. So we've got some information there about what they're used for, how we get them, so the mining of them. If you have a look at that bar chart there, you can see that actually lithium batteries don't provide us with very much energy compared to gasoline. So we can get them to start evaluating the impact. Is the impact on the environment to obtain these metals? Does that negate for the carbon dioxide that is released by burning fossil fuels? So we can get them to start linking their understanding of combustion within chemistry, of the role of lithium batteries and how we get them, and start evaluating and deepening that learning. So here we've obviously got opportunities for skill development throughout the curriculum. So we've got to look at those integral skills. We've got some examples there of how we could introduce critical thinking and problem solving, really getting them to think about, are lithium batteries the future? We've got to consider the cross-curricular skills within progression, so disciplinary literacy, the role of numeracy and digital competency, and also the wider skills such as scientific literacy, and considering that statement, just because we can, should we? And the principle of progression, the final one there, so refinement and growing sophistication in the use and application of skills of evaluating and organizing information. The bottom bit there that I've highlighted in yellow, increasing sophistication of ideas and being able to apply understanding in various contexts is how we develop progression. And we've got to make connections and transfer that learning to new contexts. So here we're transferring from understanding of the atomic nature of matter to understanding the atomic structure, to being able to link that, make connections with the environment, so to apply and use previously acquired knowledge and skills in different, unfamiliar and challenging contexts. So just one more slide from me. So here's Tom, another of my favourites. A coherent curriculum is one where learning experiences, knowledge and skills are sequenced and woven together such that students form a deep understanding both within and between the various subjects and knowledge domains. That's me. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.